method inside the main method. However, file1 has a private field now here as the access level. So this is a private method. So here what happens is if I were to try to run my file2 on my command line here, then it's going to give me an error saying it tried to access a method called print hello world from file1. However, you're not allowed to do that because file1's print hello world method is private. So static is something that's a little complicated, and we only can really understand it when we go over classes and objects, so I will be skipping over this. But for the sake of this tutorial, for simplicity's sake, all of our methods are going to be defined to be static. So now return types. So we just went over the access level of our methods, and we just skipped over static, and now we need to talk about the fact that in all Java functions, we must define the return type. So what does this method return at the end of the method? So in main function's case, we define it to be void. And what void means is that this method just doesn't return anything. And this is usually the case when we are just changing variable values, or if we are printing something. In those cases, we're not returning anything. However, in other cases, we can return integers, boolean, and strings, so you can put these as return types instead if you do want to return those data types. So now let's look at this exercise. I want you to pause this video for a second and just try to see, without looking at the actual definitions of each methods, and see what these functions would return. So what data type should each method return? And I will go over them right now. So let's look at int number equals add numbers. So it seems like it's going to add numbers 1 and 2. And we are going to be putting that value inside this number variable, and the number variable is declared to be an integer. So I can already tell that the return type of this add numbers method will be an integer. In that same style, we see that we have a float num, which is declared to be a floating point number, and we are calling add floats. So we're adding two floating point numbers, 1 and 2. So it seems like the return type for add floats is going to be float. And here we have string declared to be as string, and then we are writing a random string, so it's probably going to generate some random string to us. So the return type for this method should be a string. And here we have another method. It's called print hello world, just by looking at the method name. And because we're not going to be assigning this method to a specific variable, we can already tell that this is probably going to be void. It's just going to print something and it won't be returning anything to us. So anytime we have something where we are saying a variable here equals some method, that means that the method is going to return a specific data type, and that data is going to be stored inside the variable. So here are the solutions. And now I have the following exercises, so I will actually be uploading this solution onto the GitHub repository, so I'll be skipping this over in our code demos. But here I am asking you guys, so here we have a main method. And inside the main method, it seems like we're using this function called addInts. Right now, if you try to compile and run it, it's not going to work because we have not defined what addInts is just yet, which is your job here in this bottom section. So I have declared the following methods for you guys already, and I am going to be passing in a variable value number 1 and number 2. So try to define a method so that it'll add two numbers together, and try to look at the declaration here to see what it's supposed to return at the end. And so like I said, I just said print passing arguments into methods, so it's really easy. So when you are declaring your method and you're going to define it, here inside the parentheses, all you have to do is just declare the type of the value you're going to pass in and the variable name. And because I'm printing numbers 1 through 5, for example, here I just say int start, so the starting number, and int end, so I'm going to be ending with this number. So I just the variable names don't really matter that much for the functionality sake of this Java code, but as a programmer, it's just easier to see when you say start and end. That means that you know that this number has to be smaller than this variable end. So now your job here is so that I had provided this calling the method of print numbers 1 through 5, 0 to 11, and 10 to 12, but I have not actually defined this method just yet. So I want you guys to define print numbers with the following arguments that I'm passing in. And some hint to show you guys is to look at what bad example is doing in the previous slides, and possibly you can take code from there in order to write the definition for print numbers. So I just said calling this method or call this method a lot. And so how do we do that and what does that mean? Calling a method just means using the actual method. So we've been talking about how to define methods, but we need to now know how to use them. So there are actually 3 different ways to call a method, and we're only going to be focusing on 2 of them. So calling a method from the same class file, which is something that we've seen the most so far, or calling a static method from 2 different class files, and we saw an example of that already, but I just wanted to formally introduce you to those 2 cases. And then there's a third case, which is calling a method from an object, and we'll be going over this more in detail in the later videos. But I just wanted to let you know, majority of the time we are going to be using method calls from an object rather than from static methods. It's actually pretty bad practice to be using static method calls rather than object method calls. So calling a static method from a different class file. So this is the same example as we saw before, which is where we have file 1 and file 2, where in file 1 we have a public print hello world defined, and in file 2 we have a main method that calls that print hello world method from file 1. All we have to do is have the class name, exactly the spelling, dot the method name from that class file, and then we just put the parentheses there. And we can already see the illustration here. We have the class name file1 dot print hello world, which is the name of the method, and then the parentheses. And because there's no argument inside, I don't put anything inside the parentheses. So we're going to go over more of this dot notation later on in our videos, but essentially on the right hand side of the dot is the actual stuff that we want, which is the method in this case. And the left-hand side of the dot usually means the address where that method is coming from. And this is pretty simple. In this case, we're getting the print hello world method from file 1. So that's kind of like the idea of what dot notation is, but we'll talk more about that in detail in the later videos. So calling a method within the same class file is super easy. And this works for both static and non-static methods. And so we have this good example again, and in our main method, we are calling print numbers. So anytime you're calling something from the same exact class file, you just have to state the method name and put in whatever arguments you need to put in, and then that's the end of story. And the reason why we do this is because we already know where this method exists. It exists in this file, so Java automatically knows that.